There are some stories you only see in documentaries about local government, until it happens right in front of your eyes. I lived peacefully in a small cabin my grandfather left me. No neighbors, no disputes. But then one day, a strange woman in fake designer clothes declared that the only road to my house was harmful to the community, and immediately put up fences and no trespassing signs. No one expected such a stupid decision to lead to consequences that the entire residential area would have to pay for weeks. Have you ever encountered an HOA that behaved like this? Comment below and let me know what state you're living in, because I'm about to tell you the most ridiculous and scary series of events about a dirt road and a water supply system. My name is Gavin Reed, and for 15 years, I've called the old cabin my grandfather built home. It sits on a hill overlooking the Willowbrook Heights subdivision, connected to civilization by a single dirt road that winds through the trees. Grandpa built that road himself back in 1952, and the city gave him written permission, confirming they wouldn't interfere with it unless there was an emergency. For a decade and a half, I'd driven that same path every day to my job as a construction engineer, never bothering anyone, never causing trouble. The people down in the subdivision lived their lives, and I lived mine. It was the perfect arrangement, until Whitney Cross got elected as the new HOA president. Whitney was 29 years old, recently married to a local car dealership owner, and had that particular brand of ambition that comes from having just enough money to be dangerous. She wore clothes that screamed expensive but looked cheap, carried purses with logos so big you could see them from space, and had the kind of confidence that only comes from never being told no. But what made Whitney truly dangerous wasn't her tackiness or her attitude. It was the fact that she was running for city council and needed community improvement projects to pad her resume. The woman had political aspirations, and unfortunately for me, my quiet little dirt road was about to become her stepping stone to power. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I saw the notice in my mailbox. Instead of the usual HOA newsletter filled with reminders about trash can placement and dog waste cleanup, this one had a different tone entirely. Community Infrastructure Modernization Project, it read in bold letters across the top. The language was all corporate speak and buzzwords, but the message was clear. Whitney Cross and the Willowbrook Heights HOA were planning to upgrade the transportation network throughout the entire area. My road wasn't specifically mentioned, but when I saw the attached map, there it was. My private access road marked in bright red as part of their improvement zone. That evening, I decided to attend the community meeting Whitney had scheduled at the subdivision's clubhouse. I rarely ventured down into Willowbrook Heights, preferring the peace of my hilltop cabin, but something about that map bothered me. The clubhouse was packed with residents, most of whom seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of road improvements. Whitney stood at the front of the room, pointing to a large display board with architectural renderings and construction timelines. She wore a bright pink blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments, and her smile was so wide it looked painful. "We're going to make Willowbrook Heights the premier community in the county," she announced to scattered applause. "No more dirt roads, no more outdated infrastructure. We're bringing this neighborhood into the 21st century." As she clicked through her presentation, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Whitney knew exactly which roads belonged to the HOA and which ones didn't. I could tell by the way she deliberately avoided eye contact when she talked about expanding our improvement zone to include adjacent access routes. This wasn't ignorance or an honest mistake. This was a calculated land grab, and she was using the community improvement project as cover. When the question and answer session began, I raised my hand. "Miss Cross," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "that road you've marked on your map, the one leading up to the cabin on the hill, that's private property. It's been in my family since 1952. Whitney's smile never wavered, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. "Well, Mr. Reed," she replied smoothly, "we'll certainly look into the specifics, but I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." After the meeting, I lingered in the parking lot, watching as Whitney posed for photos for her phone, documenting what she'd probably post online as another successful community engagement event. But I'd seen enough corporate presentations in my engineering career to recognize a setup when I saw one. Whitney Cross hadn't just stumbled onto my road by accident. She'd targeted it specifically, and now I needed to figure out why. As I drove back up my dirt road that night, I made a mental note to call my old college friend April Monroe, who worked at the county surveyor's office. If Whitney wanted to play games with property lines and legal definitions, she was about to discover that some of us knew how to play back. The next morning brought clear skies and the sound of heavy machinery echoing up from the subdivision below. Whitney hadn't wasted any time getting her project started, and from my kitchen window I could see orange construction cones and yellow caution tape being installed along the subdivision's main thoroughfares. It looked professional and legitimate, exactly the kind of community improvement project that would photograph well for campaign materials, but I knew it was just the opening move in what was about to become a very interesting game. Whitney Cross didn't become HOA president by being stupid, and her approach to stealing my road proved she understood the value of appearing legitimate. Instead of immediately blocking my access or putting up aggressive signage, she started with what looked like genuine community improvement. Over the next week, Dale Proctor's construction crew began working on the subdivision's internal roads, repaving sections that genuinely needed attention and installing new street lighting that actually improved the neighborhood. To anyone watching from the outside, Whitney was delivering exactly what she'd promised: infrastructure, modernization that increased property values and community appeal. But I was watching from the inside, and I could see the pattern emerging. Each day, Dale's crew moved a little closer to the boundary between HOA property and my grandfather's old access road. They installed new drainage systems that happened to extend just slightly beyond the subdivision's official borders, and they marked out areas for future expansion that coincidentally included the lower section of my dirt road. Whitney made sure to document every step of the process, creating content for her campaign that showed her delivering tangible results for her constituents. She was building a paper trail that would make her eventual claim to my road look like a natural extension of necessary community improvements. Meanwhile, her deputy Tina Walsh was working the social media angle with military precision. Tina had been Whitney's closest ally since the election, a 34-year-old marketing professional who understood how to shape public opinion through carefully crafted messaging. She created a dedicated webpage for the Willowbrook Heights modernization project, complete with before and after photos, progress updates, and glowing testimonials from residents whose streets had been improved. More importantly, she began seeding the narrative that would justify Whitney's eventual move on my property. Comments about outdated access routes that compromise emergency response times, and the need for standardized infrastructure throughout the greater community started appearing in the HOA's communications. The first direct challenge came on a Friday afternoon, when I found Dale Proctor and two of his workers standing at the bottom of my access road, measuring distances and taking photographs. Dale was a 40-year-old contractor who'd built his business on HOA projects, and he had the comfortable demeanor of someone who'd never been told he couldn't do something. When I approached him, I could see the measuring tape stretched across the entrance to my road like an invisible declaration. We're about to take this part. I stared at that measuring tape, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just surveying. This was claiming. "Dale, you just put surveying equipment on my family's land," I said, my voice steady but carrying an edge I rarely used. "Every inch of this area has documented ownership papers." He smiled with the casual confidence of someone who'd been told this would be easy. "Whitney says there might be some errors in the old maps," he replied, still holding his end of the measuring tape. "I'm just doing my job." The dismissive tone in his voice, like I was some confused old man who didn't understand modern property management, made something snap inside me. I reached out and yanked the measuring tape from his hands. "Then do your job somewhere that doesn't have 'read property' since 1952 marked on every boundary post." His expression changed, and I saw him exchange a look with his workers that I recognized all too well. It was the look people gave each other when they thought someone was being unreasonable about something they had every right to control. The look that said, I was the problem, not them. The familiar feeling of being dismissed as an obstacle washed over me, but this time it came with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't going to be like other times when I just accepted that other people knew better. Not this time. Not with my grandfather's land. I turned and walked back to my cabin, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and determination. The casual way Dale had tried to measure my property, like it was already theirs, told me everything I needed to know about Whitney's real intentions. This wasn't about community improvement or safety standards. This was about taking what didn't belong to them because they thought I wouldn't fight back. I went straight to my grandfather's old filing cabinet, pulled out the folder of property documents I'd inherited but never really studied, and dialed April Monroe's number. If Whitney wanted to play games with property lines and legal definitions, it was time I learned exactly what cards I was holding. That weekend, I decided to do some strategic intelligence gathering of my own. Instead of staying isolated in my cabin, I made a point of being visible around the subdivision. I stopped by the community mailbox cluster during peak hours when residents were collecting their mail, and I attended the Saturday morning farmers market that was held in the clubhouse parking lot. What I discovered was that Whitney's modernization project had genuinely improved life for most residents, but it had also created an expectation of continued progress. People were talking about property values, about attracting young families, about competing with the newer subdivisions being built across town. Whitney had successfully convinced them that infrastructure improvement was the key to their community's future. But I also detected undercurrents of concern, and that's when I had my most revealing conversation of the weekend. At the farmer's market, I was examining some late-season tomatoes when an elderly woman approached me with the careful steps of someone who had something important to say, but wasn't sure she should say it. "You're Gavin Reed, aren't you?" she asked quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I'm Linda Morrison. I live at the end of Magnolia Street." She moved closer and lowered her voice even further. "You need to be careful of that cross woman. She's got a way of making people think they don't have choices when they actually do." Linda's next words hit me like a physical blow. "She did the same thing to me 2 years ago," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of regret. "I had a small lot next to the electrical substation that my husband left me. Whitney started sending letters about non-compliant fencing and safety violations. Said the HOA had authority over properties that affected community infrastructure." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, and I didn't know who to ask for help, so I sold it to her for half what it was worth. Found out later she didn't have any legal authority over my property at all." The woman looked at me with an expression that mixed sadness, anger, and something that looked like guilt. "I didn't fight back, and I've regretted it every day since," she said. "Don't be like me, Mr. Reed. Don't let her convince you that you don't have rights you actually have." She pressed a piece of paper into my hand with her phone number written on it. "If you need someone to testify about her methods, you call me. It's time someone stood up to her." As Linda walked away, I realized that Whitney's attack on my property wasn't an isolated incident driven by political ambition. It was part of a systematic pattern of bullying that had been going on for years. That evening, I sat in my grandfather's old chair and read through every document in his property file with new eyes. The 1952 survey maps, the easement agreements, the correspondence with county officials. It was all there, carefully preserved and completely legitimate. But more than that, I began to understand the strategic thinking behind my grandfather's negotiations with the county. He hadn't just secured access to his property, he'd positioned himself as a critical part of the area's infrastructure development. The man had been thinking 70 years ahead, and Whitney Cross had no idea what she was actually challenging. When I found the formal letter from the HOA in my mailbox that evening, I read it with grim satisfaction rather than concern. Whitney had just put her illegal intentions in writing, and thanks to Linda Morrison, I now knew this was part of a pattern that other people had documentation about. As I filed the letter with my grandfather's papers, I realized that Whitney Cross had just made her first serious mistake. She'd declared war on someone who was finally ready to fight back, and she had no idea that I was about to discover exactly how much power my grandfather had built into that old dirt road. The game was officially underway, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to the next move. April Monroe called me early Monday morning with news that changed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather's property arrangements. "Gavin, you need to sit down for this," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd stumbled onto something significant. "I spent the weekend digging through the old county records, and what your grandfather negotiated in 1952 was way more comprehensive than either of us realized." She explained that my grandfather hadn't just secured a simple access easement. He'd negotiated what the county called a critical infrastructure access agreement that gave him permanent rights to the road and made him the designated emergency access coordinator for the entire surrounding area. The implications were staggering. Not only did I have undisputed legal ownership of my access road, but I also had official county authority over emergency vehicle access to a geographic area that included the water treatment facility at the base of the hill. "April, what water treatment facility?" I asked, though I was already getting a sinking feeling about the answer. The one that supplies water to Willowbrook Heights and 3 other subdivisions, she replied. It's built into the hillside about half a mile past your cabin. The only road access to it runs right through your property. I hung up the phone and immediately walked outside to look down the hill with new eyes. Sure enough, barely visible through the trees, I could make out the concrete structure I'd always assumed was just an old utility building. But I wasn't ready to play my strongest card yet. Whitney had shown her hand with the formal letter, but I wanted to understand the full scope of her plans before I revealed what I knew about the water facility. So I decided to set a trap that would make her reveal more about her true intentions. I called the local newspaper and gave them a carefully worded interview about a property rights dispute between a local resident and an overreaching HOA. I made sure to mention specific details about the 1952 easement and the HOA's attempt to claim authority over private property. The article was published on Wednesday, complete with a photo of me standing next to the historical survey markers at the entrance to my road. Whitney's response was swift and revealed exactly the kind of legal weakness I'd hoped to expose. By Thursday morning, I'd received a call from Greg Sutton, the lawyer she'd hired to handle what she was now calling the Reed property situation. Greg had the smooth confidence of someone who specialized in intimidating people who couldn't afford good legal representation. "Mr. Reed, I represent the Willowbrook Heights Homeowners Association," he said. "My client is prepared to offer you reasonable compensation for incorporating your access road into the community improvement project." I let Greg make his presentation, taking careful notes as he outlined Whitney's legal theory about conditional easements that could be modified due to changed circumstances. It was creative but completely wrong, and confirmed that Whitney had no idea about the water facility. That afternoon, I contacted Harold Vance, the director of the county water department, and requested a formal inspection of the emergency access protocols for the Hillside Treatment Facility. Harold was a 45-year veteran of county government who understood the importance of maintaining critical infrastructure access, and he agreed to meet me at the facility the following day. When we walked the access road together, Harold confirmed what April had discovered in the county records. "Your grandfather was ahead of his time, Gavin," he said, pointing to the carefully engineered drainage systems that had maintained the route's integrity for 7 decades. This agreement was designed to ensure permanent emergency access, regardless of how the surrounding area developed. Harold also shared information that added a new dimension to the situation. "The treatment facility is scheduled for major upgrades next year," he explained. "We'll need heavy equipment access for at least 6 months, and this road is the only route that can accommodate the machinery we'll need." He looked down the hill toward Willowbrook Heights, where Dale Proctor's construction equipment was still visible. "If someone were to interfere with this access road, it would compromise not just the upgrade project, but our ability to maintain the existing system. We're talking about water service for over 800 families." As Harold and I concluded our inspection, I realized that Whitney's power play had the potential to create consequences far beyond anything she'd imagined. Her focus on political advancement had blinded her to the critical infrastructure implications of her actions. But I also realized that I now carried responsibility for more than just my own property rights. The decisions I made in the coming weeks would affect hundreds of families who had no idea their water supply depended on a dirt road they'd probably never seen. That evening, I sat on my cabin's porch and watched the lights come on in Willowbrook Heights below. Whitney Cross thought she was fighting for control of a simple access road, but she'd actually declared war on the infrastructure that kept her entire community functioning. The irony was almost perfect. In her quest to modernize and control everything around her, she was about to discover that some things were more important than political ambition. I pulled out my phone and started drafting an email to Harold Vance, requesting a formal review of emergency access protocols for the water treatment facility. It was time to let Whitney know what she was really fighting for. The trap was set, and Whitney Cross was about to walk right into it. Whitney Cross had built her entire political strategy around controlling the narrative, but she was about to discover that some stories write themselves. Dale Proctor called her early Friday morning with news that would have sent a smarter person running for cover. "Whitney, we've got a problem with the Reed property situation," he said, his voice carrying the tension of someone who'd seen too much construction go wrong. "When my crew was surveying the area yesterday, we found some infrastructure that wasn't on any of our maps. There's a major water line running underneath that dirt road, and it connects to something big, built into the hillside." Instead of treating this information as the warning it was, Whitney saw it as an opportunity. "How major are we talking about, Dale?" she asked. already calculating how she could spin this discovery to support her claim that my road was critical community infrastructure that required HOA oversight. Dale's answer should have terrified her. "Whitney, I'm talking about the main supply line for the entire area. If something happened to that line, every house in Willowbrook Heights would lose water pressure within hours." But Whitney's political ambitions had made her deaf to anything that didn't support her predetermined goals. "Then it sounds like we have even more reason to bring that road under professional management," she replied. "Schedule the work for Monday morning." That same afternoon, Harold Vance made a discovery that would prove to be the beginning of the end for Whitney's schemes. During his routine inspection of county infrastructure records, he found documentation that made his blood run cold. The water treatment facility that supplied Willowbrook Heights and 3 surrounding subdivisions was not just accessible via my grandfather's road, it was completely dependent on it. The facility had been built in 1954, 2 years after my grandfather's easement agreement, and county engineers had specifically designed the installation to rely on the private access road for all maintenance and emergency services. "This is insane," Harold muttered as he reviewed the engineering specifications. "If someone blocks that road, we lose access to the primary water supply for 800 families. Harold immediately called me with information that transformed my understanding of the situation. "Gavin, your grandfather's agreement isn't just about your access road," he explained. "The county made him the designated emergency access coordinator because they knew that anyone who controlled that road controlled water access for the entire region. They gave him that authority to make sure no one could ever use the road as leverage against the community." The implications were staggering. My grandfather hadn't just negotiated property rights. He'd accepted responsibility for protecting critical infrastructure. And now, Whitney Cross was about to attack the very system that kept her neighbors' taps flowing. But Harold had more disturbing news. "Gavin, I've been reviewing our maintenance schedules, and we're already operating on borrowed time up there. The facility needs major repairs that we've been postponing because of budget constraints. If someone were to cause damage to the access road or the underground utilities, we might not be able to restore full service for weeks." He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "There's something else you need to know. According to our emergency protocols, if we lose access to the treatment facility, we have to implement water restrictions immediately. We're talking about trucked-in water for drinking and cooking only. No showers, no lawn watering, no washing machines." That weekend, I made a decision that would prove to be either brilliant or catastrophic. Instead of confronting Whitney directly with what I'd learned about the water facility, I decided to let her make the next move. I wanted her to commit fully to her course of action before I revealed the true stakes of her gamble. So I did something that probably looked like surrender. I called Greg Sutton and told him I was willing to negotiate. "Greg, your client has made some compelling arguments about community infrastructure," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not ready to sign anything yet, but I'm willing to discuss reasonable accommodations." Greg's response revealed exactly how confident Whitney had become in her position. "That's excellent news, Mr. Reed. My client is prepared to be very generous in recognition of your cooperation. We're talking about a substantial cash payment for your inconvenience, plus guaranteed permanent access to your property via the improved road system. He was offering me money to give up rights I didn't need to give up, and access to property I already owned. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so dangerous." "That sounds promising, Greg," I replied, "but I'll need to see the specific terms in writing before I can make any decisions." By Sunday evening, I had Whitney Cross exactly where I wanted her. She believed she was negotiating from a position of strength, offering generous terms to resolve a minor property dispute that was delaying her signature community improvement project. She had no idea that she was about to trigger a crisis that would make her name synonymous with municipal disaster. Dale Proctor had his equipment positioned and ready to begin work on Monday morning, and Whitney had scheduled a media event to celebrate the successful resolution of the last remaining obstacle to community modernization. But I wasn't quite ready to spring the trap yet. That night, I made one final phone call to Harold Vance. "Harold, I need you to make sure someone from your department is available Monday morning," I said. "I have a feeling Whitney Cross is about to create an emergency that will require immediate county intervention." Harold's response was grim but professional. "Gavin, I've already alerted our emergency response team. If someone damages that water line, we'll have trucks rolling within the hour. But once the damage is done, we're looking at weeks of repairs and water restrictions that will affect every family in 4 subdivisions. As I hung up the phone, I realized that tomorrow would either end Whitney Cross's political career or make her the most hated person in 3 counties. She'd positioned herself as the champion of community improvement, but she was about to discover that some improvements come with consequences that no amount of political spin can fix. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and Whitney Cross was about to learn that controlling narratives is much easier than controlling reality. Monday morning couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes construction work pleasant, and Whitney Cross woke up believing it would be the best day of her political career. She'd scheduled a small media event to document the final phase of community infrastructure modernization, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and photo opportunities with Dale Proctor's construction equipment. Local news outlets had been invited to cover what Whitney was billing as a story about public-public cooperation and community development. She had no idea she was about to create the biggest municipal disaster in county history. Dale Proctor arrived at 7 in the morning with a full crew and heavy machinery, including the excavator that would prove to be the instrument of Whitney's downfall. Dale was a competent contractor who understood construction, but he didn't understand county infrastructure systems, and he'd made the fatal mistake of trusting Whitney's assurances that all necessary permits and clearances had been obtained. "The lady says dig, so we dig," he told his crew as they unloaded equipment at the bottom of my access road. "Should be a simple job, just clear out some old drainage and prep for paving." I watched the morning's preparations from my cabin porch, counting down the hours until Whitney's carefully constructed political narrative would collapse under the weight of physics and municipal engineering. At 9 o'clock, she arrived in her white SUV, followed by Tina Walsh in a separate car loaded with photography equipment and campaign materials. Whitney wore a bright blue pantsuit that would photograph well against the autumn foliage, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced genuine failure. "This is it, Tina," I heard her say as they surveyed the construction site. "This is the project that puts us over the top for the city council race." The first phase of excavation went exactly as planned, which only increased Whitney's confidence. Dale's crew efficiently removed the upper layer of dirt and gravel from the road surface, exposing the carefully engineered foundation that my grandfather had built 70 years earlier. Whitney documented every step of the process, creating content that showed her supervising important infrastructure work with professional expertise. Local news crews arrived at 10:30 and were treated to interviews about community leadership and the importance of bringing outdated systems into the 21st century. But by 11 o'clock, Dale's excavator had reached the depth where my grandfather's drainage system intersected with the county's water infrastructure. The first sign of trouble was a change in the soil composition that Dale's operator noticed but didn't understand. "Hey, boss," he called to Dale. "This dirt's getting pretty wet down here, and I'm seeing some kind of pipe system." Dale walked over to examine the excavation and found himself looking at a network of water lines that weren't on any of his construction drawings. "Whitney," he called across the work site, "we need to talk." What happened next unfolded with the kind of terrible inevitability that makes disasters so memorable. Whitney, surrounded by cameras and local reporters, walked over to where Dale was standing at the edge of the excavation. She looked down at the exposed water lines and made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. "Dale, those old pipes probably need to be replaced anyway," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the worksite. "Let's clear them out and install modern infrastructure that meets current safety standards." Dale hesitated, but Whitney's confidence was infectious, and she was, after all, the client paying his bills. "You sure about this, Whitney? Some of these pipes look pretty major." Whitney's smile never wavered. "Dale, I'm absolutely certain. Let's finish this project right." The excavator's bucket struck the main water line at 11:47 in the morning, and the result was immediate and spectacular. Water erupted from the broken pipe with the force of a fire hydrant, creating a geyser that soared 20 feet into the air before crashing back down onto the construction site. Dale's crew scattered like startled birds, abandoning their equipment as thousands of gallons of pressurized water turned the excavation into a muddy lake. Whitney stood frozen at the edge of the chaos, her perfect blue pantsuit spattered with mud, and her carefully styled hair dripping with county water. The local news crews, who'd come to document a routine ribbon-cutting ceremony, suddenly found themselves covering a breaking news story about municipal infrastructure failure. Within minutes, footage of the water geyser was being broadcast across the region, complete with audio of Whitney Cross declaring her absolute certainty about clearing out old pipes that needed replacement anyway. The visual was devastating, a woman who'd positioned herself as a competent community leader standing helplessly beside a disaster of her own making. But the immediate spectacle was nothing compared to the systematic failure that began unfolding across Willowbrook Heights and the surrounding subdivisions throughout the afternoon. Harold Vance received the first emergency call at 12:15 when residents began reporting sudden drops in water pressure. By 1 o'clock, entire sections of the community had lost water service completely. By 2:30, Harold was implementing emergency water rationing protocols that affected 800 families across 4 subdivisions. The repair timeline was catastrophic. Full-service restoration would require at least 2 weeks of round-the-clock work, assuming they could get the specialized equipment needed to access the treatment facility. As afternoon turned to evening, I watched from my cabin as the scope of Whitney's disaster became clear. Emergency vehicles filled the streets of Willowbrook Heights. County trucks delivered portable water tanks to central distribution points, and residents lined up with containers to collect their daily water rations. The woman who'd promised to modernize her community's infrastructure had instead reduced it to third-world conditions with a single decision to ignore critical information. Whitney Cross had finally gotten the media attention she'd always wanted, but for all the wrong reasons. That night, as I listened to the emergency sirens and county repair trucks working through the darkness, I realized that tomorrow would bring the reckoning Whitney had been unconsciously preparing for since the day she'd decided my road was hers to take. Tuesday morning brought chaos that Whitney Cross could never have imagined when she'd planned her rise to political power. By 6 a.m., Willowbrook Heights looked like a disaster zone, with county emergency vehicles parked throughout the subdivision and residents forming long lines at water distribution points. The local news had picked up the story overnight, and camera crews were documenting what reporters were calling the worst municipal infrastructure failure in county history. Whitney woke up to find her phone buzzing with dozens of missed calls from angry residents, concerned city officials, and reporters looking for comment on the disaster she'd created. The human impact of Whitney's decision was immediate and severe. The Willowbrook Heights Elementary School had to send students home early when their water supply failed. Families with young children struggled to maintain basic hygiene, and elderly residents faced serious health risks from dehydration and stress. What had started as Whitney's signature political project had become a public health emergency affecting hundreds of families who lined up each morning for their daily water rations from county emergency trucks. But perhaps the most devastating development was the community's reaction to learning exactly how their crisis had been created. Residents who'd supported Whitney's modernization project were horrified to discover that their water supply had been destroyed, not by accident or natural disaster, but by their HOA president's deliberate decision to ignore professional warnings and proceed with unauthorized excavation. Cell phone footage of Whitney telling Dale Proctor to clear out those old pipes had gone viral on social media, making her the face of municipal incompetence across the region. By Wednesday morning, the situation had attracted attention from state-level officials and national news outlets looking for content about local government failures. Whitney found herself barricaded in her house, afraid to venture outside, where angry neighbors had begun gathering with signs demanding her resignation. Tina Walsh, her former deputy and social media coordinator, had distanced herself from the disaster and was already positioning herself as a potential replacement leader for the community. Dale Proctor's construction company was facing lawsuits and regulatory investigations that would probably end his career. Thursday brought the arrival of Eleanor Monroe, April's 72-year-old mother, who'd been following the news coverage with growing recognition. Eleanor had lived in Pine Ridge Estates before moving to a retirement community across town, and she remembered Whitney Cross very well. "That woman destroyed our neighborhood too," Eleanor told April over the phone. "She was involved in some kind of drainage project that flooded half the subdivision. People lost their basements, their cars, everything." Eleanor still had documentation from the Pine Ridge disaster, including insurance claims and legal filings that showed a pattern of Whitney's involvement in infrastructure projects that went catastrophically wrong. When Eleanor arrived at my cabin Thursday afternoon carrying a banker's box full of legal documents and newspaper clippings, I realized that Whitney's attack on my road wasn't an isolated incident. "Mr. Reed," Eleanor said as she spread out photographs of flooded homes, "Whitney Cross has been doing this same thing in every community where she's lived. She identifies infrastructure projects that can make her look important, ignores professional advice, and then disappears when disasters happen. The documentation showed 3 different communities, 3 different infrastructure disasters, and Whitney Cross's name attached to all of them. Friday morning brought the call I'd been expecting since Monday's disaster. Harold Vance phoned at 7 a.m. with news that would finally end Whitney Cross's reign of terror over Willowbrook Heights. "Gavin, we've completed our damage assessment and the situation is worse than we initially thought," he said. "The break in the main line has compromised the entire distribution system. We're looking at 3 weeks minimum for full repairs, and that's assuming we can get immediate access to the treatment facility for the heavy equipment we'll need." Harold's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been working around the clock to manage a crisis he'd never expected to face. But Harold had more important news. "Gavin, I've been reviewing the county's emergency protocols, and there's something Whitney Cross doesn't know about your grandfather's agreement. In situations like this, where critical infrastructure has been damaged by unauthorized activity, the designated emergency access coordinator has full authority to control site access until repairs are completed." The implications were staggering. Not only did I have the legal right to deny Whitney access to my road, but I was actually required by county protocol to take control of the situation. "It means you're now the only person who can authorize access to the water treatment facility," Harold explained. "Whitney Cross destroyed the infrastructure, but you control the only route to fix it." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Whitney's quest for power and control had led her to the one place she'd never expected to find herself, completely dependent on the cooperation of the man whose rights she'd tried to steal. The trap had finally closed, and Whitney Cross was about to discover what it felt like to be powerless. Saturday morning brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that made the chaos engulfing Willowbrook Heights seem almost surreal. While residents continued lining up for emergency water distributions and county crews worked around the clock to assess the damage, I sat on my cabin porch with a cup of coffee and watched the community Whitney Cross had promised to modernize, struggling with the basic necessities of life. The irony was perfect. In her quest to control everything around her, Whitney had created a situation where she controlled nothing at all. The call came at 10 a.m., exactly when I'd expected it. Harold Vance was on the line with news that would finally force Whitney Cross to face the consequences of her actions. "Gavin, we need to talk immediately," Harold said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who'd spent days managing an impossible situation. "The county has reviewed all available options for restoring water service, and there's only one viable solution. We need immediate and unrestricted access to your property to bring in the heavy equipment required for system repairs." Harold paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "The problem is, according to our legal department, Whitney Cross's actions have triggered the emergency access protocols in your grandfather's original agreement. You're now the designated authority for all access decisions." Within an hour, my cabin had become the unofficial command center for resolving the worst municipal crisis in county history. Harold Vance arrived first, followed by county engineers, legal representatives, and finally, Whitney Cross herself. Accompanied by what remained of her rapidly shrinking support network, Whitney looked like she'd aged a decade in the past week. Her signature designer clothes had been replaced by rumpled casual wear. Her perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her famous confidence had been replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone watching their world collapse. But the most important arrival was Eleanor Monroe, who'd driven up from her retirement community with her banker's box of documentation and a determination to finally hold Whitney Cross accountable for decades of infrastructure disasters. "Miss Cross," Eleanor said as Whitney stepped out of her car, "I believe we've met before. Pine Ridge Estates, 7 years ago. You probably don't remember me, but I certainly remember you." Whitney's face went pale as Eleanor began pulling out photographs and legal documents. "Flooded basements, ruined gardens, destroyed driveways. You told us then that you were modernizing outdated drainage systems. Does that sound familiar?" The confrontation that followed was everything I'd hoped for and more. With county officials, legal representatives, and news crews as witnesses, Eleanor methodically documented Whitney's pattern of infrastructure disasters across multiple communities. Each project had followed the same pattern: ambitious promises about community improvement, rejection of professional advice, catastrophic failure, and Whitney's disappearance to start the cycle again somewhere else. "The only difference this time," Eleanor concluded, "is that she can't run away. The damage is too big, and too many people are watching." Harold Vance stepped forward with the documentation that would finally end Whitney's reign of terror. Ms. Cross, the county has completed its investigation into the infrastructure damage at this site, he announced formally. Our engineers have determined that the water system failure was caused by unauthorized excavation of protected utility infrastructure, conducted without proper permits or safety protocols. Harold's voice carried the authority of someone delivering an official government finding. The estimated cost of repairs exceeds $200,000, and the timeline for full-service restoration is 3 to 4 weeks. But the real moment of justice came when Harold explained the legal framework that would govern the restoration process. Ms. Cross, under the terms of the original 1952 Emergency Access Agreement, Mr. Reed has full authority over access to the water treatment facility during emergency repair operations, Harold continued. This means that restoration of water service to your community is entirely dependent on Mr. Reed's cooperation and approval. Whitney's expression shifted from confusion to horror as she realized that her attempt to seize control of my road had instead given me complete control over her community's recovery. The terms I offered Whitney were fair but decisive. First, she would immediately resign from her position as HOA president and withdraw from the city council race. Second, she would publicly acknowledge responsibility for the infrastructure disaster and issue formal apologies to every affected resident. Third, she would provide full financial restitution for all repair costs and damages. Fourth, she would agree to a permanent legal restriction preventing her from holding any leadership position in any homeowners association or community organization. And finally, she would never again interfere with my family's property rights or emergency access responsibilities. Whitney's response revealed the complete collapse of someone who'd built their identity around controlling others. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I was trying to help the community." But Eleanor Monroe wasn't finished with her yet. "Ms. Cross, you've been trying to help communities for over a decade," Eleanor replied coldly, "and every single time, you've left families homeless, businesses ruined, and neighborhoods destroyed. The only thing you've ever helped is your own political career, and now, even that's over." The formal agreement was signed that afternoon, with county officials and legal representatives serving as witnesses. Whitney Cross's signature looked shaky and uncertain, a far cry from the bold flourishes she'd used to sign the modernization project documents that had started this entire disaster. Tina Walsh, who'd spent months supporting Whitney's political ambitions, formally accepted the position of interim HOA president and committed to rebuilding community trust through transparent and responsible leadership. The restoration work began immediately, with county crews and specialized contractors working around the clock to repair the water system damage. My role as emergency access coordinator meant that I supervised every aspect of the recovery operation, ensuring that the repairs were completed properly and that nothing like this could ever happen again. 3 weeks later, water service was fully restored to all affected areas, and the treatment facility had been upgraded with modern safety systems that would prevent future disasters. Whitney Cross quietly left Willowbrook Heights the following month, selling her house to the first buyer who made an offer and disappearing without saying goodbye to anyone. Dale Proctor's construction company went out of business, but Dale himself found work with a county contractor who appreciated his hard-earned understanding of infrastructure safety protocols. 6 months later, I still live peacefully in my grandfather's cabin, connected to the community below by the same dirt road that's been in my family for over 70 years. The Willowbrook Heights community recovered and thrived under responsible leadership, with Tina Walsh elected as permanent HOA president in a landslide vote. Her first official act was to establish a community emergency fund that would ensure residents never again face the kind of crisis Whitney Cross had. As I sit on my porch each evening, watching the lights come on in the subdivision below, I'm reminded that sometimes the most powerful response to someone trying to control you is simply refusing to play by their rules. Whitney Cross spent months trying to seize control of my road, never realizing that she was actually putting herself completely at my mercy. In the end, the woman who'd promised to modernize everything around her discovered that some things, like justice, responsibility, and the consequences of her actions, are as permanent as the hills themselves. The road my grandfather built still winds through the trees, still carries emergency vehicles to the water treatment facility, and still connects my quiet cabin to the community below. Whitney Cross never learned that real power comes not from controlling others, but from accepting responsibility for the trust that others place in you. Her spectacular failure taught that lesson to everyone who watched her rise and fall. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where justice delivers itself.